Hi, everybody. So I found some even more interesting Taino research about this particular artifact. This is called the Vienna Belt. And if you've seen my other videos, you'll notice that it's a very similar design as the Pigorini semi. And as we found out in that video, the Pigorini semi is actually a cap and belt set of caciques regalia. We know through Columbus's own diaries that the gifting of belts was something that the Tainos did regularly, almost like a diplomatic procedure that they had in place already before Columbus even arrived. And this particular belt is super interesting because the components are a little bit different than the other ones we've seen. And if you notice here, it has this two little hands, has the earrings, and then it's missing most of them, but it has the teeth. The two eyes are also Venetian glass. And then it has, if you look all the way up in the top, you'll notice here between me, here's one and here's another jet pieces. And on top, there seems to be brass, almost like they're loops. To me, this seems like a later addition in order to display it. Before we dive into the research, I wanted to show you the whole belt. So as you see here, here's the semi's face, and then in the back we see the two straps that would tie it. However, how would you think that this was tied? With the semi in the front or the semi at the back? Well, this little figure here answers that question for us. If you notice, it's actually, here's the belt here, and here's the other side of the belt. The semi's face is at the back. And the two straps are actually tied in the front. But you can see the whole set, the belt, and then the cap. So after the DNA testing started to reveal that the Taino DNA did not just disappear, that they weren't simply exterminated, but that they have descendants today that include us, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Jamaicans, etc., amongst the other islands in the Caribbean, in the Greater Antilles. A lot of research started to pop out. So this research paper was published in 2013. And I thought that some of the things that this article claims were super interesting. So as many know, the Tainos were the first Native Americans that Columbus ever encountered in 1492. And it was the Taino art and regalia that was first presented to the king and queen of Spain. And Bartolomé de las Casas actually describes Colón's return to Spain in 1493. We know that among the things presented to the king and queen were cotton Taino belts. And they were highly admired. And if we read down here in the description in the bottom, it says they were green parrots, which were very beautiful and colorful, and also guaycas, which are jeweled masks made from fish bones. We now know that they're shells, inlaid and decorated with pearls and gold, as well as some belts made in the same way with artistry and many samples of the finest native goldwork and other things never before seen or heard of in Spain. So we know that the Taino belts were also highly admired and prized in Europe. And they were given to other members of the court and families of the royal house. It became extremely popular to possess these items. And I really like this chart here below me because it shows the three surviving cotton samples that we have. So we have the Vienna Belt, which is this one. Earliest documented proof of it is from 1877. The Pigorini semi, which I spoke about on another video, earliest is 1680. And then the Turin semi, the cotton semi, which is about 2 feet tall, is from 1891. This particular cotton Taino belt is actually associated with Columbus's initial voyages. I really like the way this author explains why these pieces were so valuable. A comment on the bottom and says, "Oh, one of the most prestigious of Taino valuables, a personal ornament that literally wrapped the wearer in wealth, status, and spiritual power." Because as we remember, the semi was their ancestral spirit. They went into a trance in their caoba ceremonies, trying to reach the semis in order to have them guide the whole entire village. We don't have any images of females wearing the belts. So some historians, like it says here, Peter Rowe, suggest that the Taino belts were key masculine pieces. So, but that they were woven by women. And we know that the women were the ones who did the weaving in Taino society. And we also know that in many South American cultures, the women continue to be the weavers. So part of the reason as to why it is suspected that this belt might have been one of the originals that Colon brought over is that part of his description of his interaction with El Cacique Guacanagari was the large amount of gifts and belts that Guacanagari gave to him. We know that as part of their initial encounter, Guacanagari sent one of his attendants to present Columbus, as it says here, with a fine belt featuring a mask inlaid with gold. So Colon wrote, the ambassador was sent with a belt that instead of a purse had a mask, which had two large ears, a tongue, and a nose of hammered gold. This belt was made with something like fine stones, very small and pearl-like, made of white fish bones, which we now know are shells and not fish bones, interspersed with some colored ones, like a kind of needlework. It was worked in such a way with the cotton thread so tightly sewn and with such beautiful skill that both the front and back of the belt appeared beautifully made, all in white, that it was a pleasure to see, as if it was woven on a frame and in the way that the weavers make the edges of chasubles in Castile. And it was so hard and so strong that without a doubt, I believe an arquebus, which was a type of pew-pew, could not shoot through it, or only with difficulty. It was 4 fingers in width, in the matter of those used by the kings and great lords of Castile, embroidered or made of gold. We also know of a young cacique who isn't named, who first gave Colon belts even before Guacanagari did. It says he was carried on a litter and he had around 200 attendants. He says that after they ate, one of the attendants was sent to bring him a belt that was somewhat like the Castilian ones, but of a different workmanship, and he gave it to me. Columbus then gifted him some items, including red shoes. And we know that this exchange, as it says here, wasn't a typical like trade like they would do in daily life. It was something special. So we know that the belts were something very important to the Tainos and they were highly valued. And we see how the gift giving continued among the higher ranking members of society, because Colon didn't give these belts to just any of his men. He gave it to the king and queen, the Catholic monarchs. We know through the descriptions that belts, caps, and even capes were very predominantly put on the caciques person. When Colon reached Jamaica, we know that he was received with even more pomp by the Jamaican cacique that greeted him there. It describes that the cacique in full regalia, accompanied by his family and vassals, came to the ship in 3 canoes with much ceremony and pomp. Several of the chief's retinue wore cotton caps covered with green or white parrot feathers, ingeniously worked, and one identified as a herald wore a cloak of red feathers. I can just imagine that, a cloak of red feathers. Cacique was resplendent with a guanin or gold copper alloy pendant as large as a plate, stone beads which they also value highly, and guanin ear ornaments. On his head he wore a garland of small stones, green and red, arranged in order and intermingled with some larger white stones, producing a pleasing effect, and although he was naked, he wore a girdle of the same workmanship as the garland, and all the rest of his body was exposed. This girdle is the belt. We also note the importance of the belts because in most of the figures that we have from Taino art, it's the semis that wear the belts. And even the duos or the caciques' thrones have depictions of the belt. I hope you can see this clearly, but up right in the middle here, you see it like a design swirl. That is the belt on a duo. This is cacique's throne. When Colon returned on his second voyage in 1493, he found that the Fortaleza Navidad and all of his men had been destroyed. He had left them in the care of Guacanagari. So their first meeting after this had happened was extremely tense. But as it mentions here, there were gifts of friendship and pledges of loyalty were exchanged in an effort to reestablish peaceful relations between Guacanagari and Colón. And we have the description of what these gifts were: a gold pendant, which he was wearing on his forehead, Guacanari was wearing, and which he eagerly offered to the admiral. He also took off the cotton, I don't know how to say that in English, in Spanish is diadema, but basically cotton crown from his own head and put it on Columbus's. And in addition to this, gave him 12 sword belts of marvelous workmanship. Several of them were notable for nuggets of gold worked very artistically into the silk. So there's some discrepancy about the amount of belts given in this exchange, but what we do know is that they were finished with different colored stones and a headpiece adorned with the same stone. And he obviously presented these gifts once again to Ferdinand and Isabella at court in Spain in 1496. And we have the description of that. It says, on arrival at Burgos, he was well received by the Catholic monarchs, to whom he presented a great quantity of things and specimens that he brought from the Indies, including many masks and belts with plates of gold set in place of eyes and ears. And this is also how we know, apart from Anacaona's own story, that the Tainos were masters in cotton making, cotton production of 3D items, because it says that included in all of the things that the admiral brought back were many indigenous things of woven cotton, including crowns, masks, belts, and collars. Anacaona herself had a huge storehouse of many cotton pieces of furniture. And this part here is what I found really interesting. This research paper describes how some of the belts might have not been gifts. Instead, they might have been stolen. And they describe how Caonabo was captured in 1494. And that part of the descriptions of what was taken from him and his family were belts. So it says that Sebastián de Olaño, the official receiver, he left Española March 10th, 1495. And so he wrote everything that was being brought back to Spain. And he noted that there were indigenous treasures being brought to the Spanish, including material specifically attributed to Caonabo's family and his family members, and members of his cacicazgo. So on July 9th, 1495, a belt with a green face and 2 leaves of gold was brought by some of Caonabo's men, along with a number of other cotton valuables. Guasa, naguas, and a hammock was entered into the inventory. The final entries on February 19th, 1496, including a vomiting spatula with 27 pieces of gold and a carátula or guasa with 7 pieces of gold, are specifically noted as having been taken from Caonabo and his heirs when they were in prison. So the table up top describes the belts that we know were given to Colón and then who it was attributed to. The writer notes that maybe some of those belts were given in order to try to secure Caonabo's release, but obviously that didn't work. We know that Caonabo died en route to Spain in 1496, but historian Benaldez says that his brother survived. Supposedly, Columbus ordered him to wear some of the regalia when entering into the cities and other inhabited places. And the objects owned by Caonabo himself, the first indigenous ruler to oppose colonial rule, were also part of the spectacle of Columbus's meeting with the Catholic monarchs. They especially brought out a crown, which they said belonged to the cacique Caonabo, very large and high, depicting the devil. So we know that depicting the devil meant a semi. So we know that the belts were used as almost a sign of a treaty. They were trying to establish good relationships with these new invaders. And these belts, for them, were really a pathway to achieving that. We know that even after relations disintegrated among the Tainos and the Spanish, the belts were still very much valued. We know that in 1511, they were auctioned off as indigenous war booty in Puerto Rico. But we know that Most of these items were later lost, and they speak about an example of four indigenous belts that were in the collection Munich, Germany, that were simply lost after the 30 Years' War. And then this footnote, number 36, right down here, this kind of threw me off because it says that Ricardo Alegria has suggested that the Vienna Belt could be Caonabos, although the former lacks the green face mentioned in the inventory. We can't determine if the belt was Caonabos, but we can absolutely be certain that it belonged to a cacique. So the first mention of the Vienna Belt ever documented is in 1877. And as it says here, when it was transferred from the Vienna, I don't know how to say that, Schatzkammer, sorry, to the Embracer Sammlung collection. Its history before that is obscure. And even at this point, the origin of this belt was already lost by this time because it describes it as being plated woolen belts covered with countless small rings of different colors, which are cut from seashells. And then it says probably Malaysian or from East Indian archipelago. The reference that it was possibly of Malaysian or of the East Indian archipelago was later crossed out, as it says here in pencil. It was later attributed to the Congo in 1888 until finally it was identified as a Taino piece in 1952. I found it curious that all of these pieces were suddenly rediscovered in 1952. I want to research a little bit more as to what happened. How did they all become discovered in 1952? But the article goes on to explain that it became so popular among the royalty to have personal collections of items from the Americas. So it was very common for there to be artifacts in different royal houses. You know that even Ferdinand the First and Ferdinand the Second all had sizable collections. We even know that the Medicis had their own America's collection that they would bring out in order to entertain their guests. And we know that their collection included Taino pieces. And because all three semis, the Turin, the Picorini, and the Vienna belt semi, however you want to describe them, were all in Italy, the article suggests that maybe they were once all part of one collection, and that later on they were dispersed. The composition of the Vienna belt is of note. Like all of the other artifacts, is made of cotton, it's made of shells. The cronistas were so impressed by the way the shells were put together in this main frame of cotton that they described it as a kind of needlework in shell done to a pleasing effect. We know that the belt contains about 11,000 beads. Just in the central semi section, there's about 1,200 beads, with the rest, about 9,500, on either straps. And even Bartolomé de las Casas notes how the conchitas, or the little stones, were weaved into this framework in a way that they lasted perpetually. In other words, forever. And here we are 500 years later, still admiring that work. We also know that there was actually a bead manufacturing site on Grand Turks and Caicos Islands, where we know that the Tainos from La Española went to manufacture their beads. And if we take into account the process of the cotton, because you have to grow it, you have to pick it, you have to gin it, you have to card it, and then you have to spin the cotton in order to get to the form of a thread. So all of these steps is labor intensive. So the value of all of it, the cotton, the shells, the beads, everything, the time consumed made these objects priceless. And here we can see example of the actual cotton thread. We see that they did like a twisting method in order to the point where they could use it. The researcher also notes that the belt is heavy. It is not lightweight. So imagine a cacique wearing all of the regalia. He had to feel that he had it on. The base of the belt, 3 layers of cotton weave, and then the shells that were intersewn into this base. And I love this part. It says their integration testifies to the weaver's intuitive understanding of how to provide internal structure and support for a functional object, essentially a wearable work of art. And that's something that I have come to the conclusion while studying the Tainos, while reading constantly about their art, about their religion, about their way of life. They were artists, and artists are not interested in manual labor. We know that it's the intellect, the creativity. These were people who valued thought, valued being able to think, design, and create. And so that's where they clashed with the Spanish. The Spanish valued art, but it was something for royalty. It wasn't something that the common man was supposed to be doing. The common man was supposed to be working, slaving away basically and not enjoying life. The Tainos had a system where everybody could enjoy life and could be basically an intellectual, a philosopher, an artist, a creator. So it was such a different type of society that was created compared to the Spanish. And there were certain points about this belt that call to attention because here, for example, this is the belt, and then this part here is actually the strap that would be tied. And the way it's done, you can't really see how it's connected, how the strap is connected to the belt. It's so seamless. This is a great example of the underbase, that cotton weave base that holds the whole figure together. We see that it is very intricate underneath the way that they designed this, for example, this space right here is missing a bead, but the rest of the structure is fine. I thought this was interesting too to see the three little hands. So all of the cotton artifacts that we have, they all have these hand depictions. We don't know if they had a meaning. We assume they do because we know that the Tainos wouldn't be adding these features just for the heck of it. But it is interesting to know that they're all very similar. They did do some carbon dating on this belt, and it came out very similar to the other two artifacts of cotton that we have. Same time range, about 1430s to I think the latest here is 60s, around there. So the researchers did comment on the different foreign elements in this belt. And this is where I was kind of like, okay. Because they speak about how these foreign elements could maybe push this item to being kind of like an item designed for European consumption, that it wasn't actually for a cacique. And they talk first about the glass. So, what many don't know about glass at this time is that the glass that the Europeans had in this medieval point in time, it was a thin piece of glass coated with lead, and it was very common. It wasn't like something special. So, it wasn't the kind of like shiny, very shiny, reflective mirror that we use nowadays, and that began to be produced around 1507. So that story that the indigenous people were wowed about, oh my god, these mirrors. No. In La Española or in Bohío or in Quisqueya, they had so many rivers. They also had the guanin and the gold that they would hammer down. They saw their reflection all the time. That's what I'm trying to say. It wasn't like something like, oh my gosh, like look at who's that? No. So as it says here, the larger and brighter those of the medieval period were the prerogative of the wealthy in Europe. So these mirrors, the mirrors that most people think were given to the indigenous population, did not exist at the time when Columbus arrived. This was much later that those mirrors came to be. The ones inside the semi's eye, we assume they're the lead ones. They're not very bright, not very clear. However, without the analysis of the chemical composition of these mirrors, we're not going to know which type of mirror it was. The Vienna Belt has a little bit of damage here on what seems like the nose part. It is suggested that a nose ring, a gold nose ring that was secured to this part, but obviously it has been lost. One curious fact about this belt is that it doesn't have any glass beads. We saw in my other video that the Pecorini semi is covered with glass beads. Maybe not completely covered, but it has a lot of glass beads. So this particular belt and semi figurine is missing that. And we know that Columbus and the other people who were authorized to go to the islands, the Caribbean islands, were told to bring glass beads in order to trade. It reached a point, as it says here, that there were about 10 million glass beads sent to the islands between 1583 and 1613. But what this particular belt does have, which is extremely rare, are jet beads. Jet beads were much more expensive than glass ones. But what is jet? Jet is a gemstone that is formed by fossilized wood. So it was a much more rare item and much more expensive. Jet was mostly reserved for rosaries and necklaces among the Spanish. But because jet was handmade, it is incredibly difficult to give it a timestamp. We can't place these particular beads in time. It is assumed that jet wasn't something that the Tainos had. However, I know from the description that Bartolomé de las Casas gives of Anacaona's warehouses of wooden objects, he describes them as being so black that they look like jet. So could these particular pieces have been made by the Tainos? We don't know. We only have one other example of a jet bead among indigenous Taino artifacts, and this was found, as it says here, in El Chorro de Maita in Cuba, which consisted of a necklace of white coral beads strung with one spherical jet bead. And this is what the jet bead looks like on the semi from the top view, and we see that it has a brass piece within it. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I really think that this was just almost like a washer when we connect things, in that the brass piece is just to hang it. That's, at least that's how I'm seeing it in a decorative perspective. We do know that brass was imported as well, and that the Tainos quickly picked it up as they did everything else. So it could just be that this was part of what this piece was for, intentionally designed in a way to be decorative so that they could hang it. However, it doesn't seem likely because of the time period, because of what's happening. But as they always say, never say never. We also have another place for a jet bead, which is right here in what is the earring portion of the semi's face. We know that this is where the Puerto Ricans get pantalla, but until these pieces are fully analyzed, we can only speculate as to the time period that they were placed. The teeth of the semi is another point of analysis in order to determine where this piece came from. The individual pieces of teeth are interesting because normally Taino pieces did not look like. Normally, this is how the Tainos would depict the teeth, as one object. Sometimes it was made of gold and other material. So the belt having individual teeth is different. And as we see here, it is missing several of the teeth, and having this exposed piece of wood does make it strange. I would think, seeing the other examples of Taino art, that this probably had a piece of either glass or gold at one point, and with all the teeth in place, you would just see one little thin line of gold. Some have speculated that these little individual pieces of shell are actually African shells. However, we know that the Tainos had plenty of shells to pick from, so that speculation is kind of odd to include. Here we see an upside down, so this is looking at the semi's teeth, but looking this way, up. So this is the chin, and this is the teeth. So we see that they're missing 1, 2, 3 teeth in there. One last point that the researchers looked into was the fact that under the jet pieces was wax. Wax was not a common element in Taino artwork. We actually don't have, from my research that I've looked, don't have any other examples of artifacts with wax. But we do know that the Europeans use wax. So the speculation is that the jet and the brass and the wax were added by Europeans later on. And the last commentary in this research paper was the fact that maybe this piece was actually just made for European consumption. And it was something that was a phenomenon at the time. Many, and it happens still now, that there are many false pieces being made in order to satisfy an audience's desire or demand for the object. We do know that later on, pieces were enhanced and designed specifically for European consumption. Could this be one of those pieces? More analysis is needed in order to determine what the actual composition of this piece is. We need to analyze better the glass, the jet, even the wax that has been placed on this figure. But for the time being, this will be another Taino artifact that we can enjoy, analyze, and learn from, because it's so obvious that the Tainos were not just a bunch of lazy people that did nothing, that knew nothing, who were savages. This is not created by a mind that is not intelligent. You have to have a certain kind of skill to create an object like this. And not only create it, but make it last over 500 years.